Welcome to Injustice in America, the Keith St.Aubin story. In this episode, self-defense, 5 life sentences, injustice. Prepare to hear a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice. Imagine a young college student, 19 years old, forced to defend himself against a violent gang. Now imagine that very act of self-preservation leading to not 1, but 5 life sentences. This isn't a hypothetical nightmare. It's the reality Keith St.Aubin has lived for nearly 3 decades in a maximum security prison. We'll delve into the shocking details of his case, uncovering prosecutorial misconduct, the devastating impact of perjured testimony, and a 2017 court ruling that recommended his release. A recommendation that, unbelievably, was ignored. This isn't just Keith's fight. It's a stark reminder that injustice can happen to anyone. Tune in to understand how this tragedy unfolded and, more importantly, how you can help bring about justice.
So what we are going to discuss and take a deeper dive into today is a situation, I would say a very serious situation, where a 19-year-old teenager was attending a festival. Actually, it was a Mardi Gras festival in Galveston, Texas, where this teenager was walking around. Let me just paint the picture for you a little. The festival has ended and random people are milling around. So an environment of a sort of after-party crowd. This is where a confrontation occurs. A group described as gangsters surrounds a kid who we learned was a teacher's aide.
2 groups of people from 2 different walks of life, for sure.
Yes. And so what happens is that there is an attack and a shooting, and the result is a 19-year-old teacher's aide is charged and convicted for murder, attempted capital murder, and is sentenced to 5 life sentences in prison. So today we are going to be digging a little into the circumstances, the trial, and the current legal states of this case.
So let me recap before we get into this discussion. This is a self-defense situation. What we know from the trial testimony and public records is that there were 3 gang members, one of whom is already a felon for weapons, drugs, and organized crime. Another is a self-proclaimed tough guy, and the last had snuck into the country and was not a legal resident of this country.
So it sounds like a group who is all breaking the law already.
There are multiple witness statements describing a gang of Mexicans surrounding a white kid, a white boy.
They say boy. Was he small?
Well, yeah, he was a teenager around 130 pounds soaking wet, according to the police reports. But we use the term boy as that is how witnesses described him in their statements to detectives.
So that is in the police records?
Yes, that is the actual language used by the witnesses. They said it was a group of Mexicans. Some even said a gang, but they were surrounding a white boy.
I have to ask, but was this racially motivated? I mean, it sounds like a group of what? Hispanics in a gang? And a white kid who is more of a college type of kid. It doesn't seem like they have a lot in common. I mean, were they just harassing him because he is white? They didn't know each other, right? I mean, are we allowed to ask the race question? I mean, if you had a group of 3 white kids attacking a Hispanic, a lot of people would be asking this question. So in all fairness, was this group racially motivated because he was white and they were not?
It is a good question. At least it is a fair question. From what we can tell, there was a lot of derogatory racial language used towards the white kid. We don't fully know if this was their motive, but there was testimony of the group saying, "Fuck the white boy," and "let's click the white boy," and a reference of "wado," which is a derogatory term depending on how it is used to say white boy.
So there were a lot of derogatory references towards the white kid's race?
Most definitely, but it never really came up as a hate crime against them. Possibly because the white kid, who I hate to just call the white kid as his name is Keith Michael St.Aubin. But yeah, Keith is white, and he was on trial to determine if his actions to defend himself fit the legal definition of self-defense.
So it was never really looked at in this scenario because Keith was being charged and not them? I mean, how does that work? If a group attacks you, it is automatically an assault on them. But if you stand up to an attack, the initial attack is no longer an assault. The only issue is if your ability to stand up for yourself is justified, their motives are no longer questioned.
It does seem that way. At least it played out that way in this situation.
Okay, I follow you.
So what ends up happening is that these gang members assaulted Keith and had him surrounded and were closing in on him, and he shoots them.
Sounds like a reasonable action to me. What was the conclusion at the trial?
Well, Keith actually received 5 life sentences for this.
What? How is that even possible? Only 1 person even died. Is that even legal?
Funny you ask that, as that question comes up more than any other and takes us from the circumstances of the case into the law. But no, it is actually not legal.
What do you mean? How can it happen if it is not legal?
Well, Keith filed to the courts in 2015 about this very issue, and in 2017, the Texas highest court of appeals told Keith that his constitutional rights were violated and that he is convicted in violation of the double jeopardy clause and that most of his convictions should be thrown out.
Why aren't they? If they said this is the case, why aren't they thrown out already?
Since his original petition or appeal that was supposed to bring this up being 20 years prior, and since it didn't include this, the courts would just leave it as it is.
Why would they do that if it violates his rights?
Well, the Texas court said that this procedure rule, which is a rule on how you appeal, says he had only 1 year to file, and since this wasn't followed properly, that they wouldn't be able to fix this.
But I thought you just said it was a constitutional violation. How is that not a big deal?
You and I both would think so. What is confusing or a little ironic is that the current trial judge and the district attorney over the case both said that in the interest of justice, that this case should be thrown out and any procedure issues should be waived and actually are waived by them, and that since it is the right thing to do, they vote to throw out the case.
They actually said that? It must be a blatant error for them to say this.
It is a published opinion in the dissent's explanation.
So why isn't it overturned again?
Well, because the Texas courts are essentially saying this can't be waived no matter what, even if it is right.
So they say the filing rules are more important than the Constitution and then this kid's life?
That is one logical way to say it.
So this could happen to anyone? If it happened to him, why not you or me?
Exactly. It is wild and scary to think about it.
So it is denied because he should have done it in his first year in prison and didn't. So because this kid didn't know how to file his appeal correctly at first?
Glad you noticed that. Yes, there are rules when you file the appeal that have to follow AEDPA guidelines. These rules say everyone has 1 year only to file to the court. So because Keith didn't explain this issue until later, when he was able to, the courts say this is why they can't overturn his convictions even though it violates the Constitution.
No matter how right it is, even if they agree with him also?
Apparently.
That is insane. How old was Keith when he was given this 1 year and expected to do this?
Well, he was 19, a 19-year-old teenager.
Let me get this correct. He was a 19-year-old teenager? A kid, really. And he was expected to learn the law in 1 year. To keep this in context, he was just convicted, potentially wrongfully, I might add, and then freshly sent to a maximum security prison. While accepting this fate and while all this is going on and being transferred around the prison system, he would have learned his rights and filed on them correctly all within 1 year. And, regardless of the constitutional rights that we can clearly see are violated, the courts won't consider them as this teenage kid should have figured all of this out within 1 year? Is this what they are saying?
Yes, that is correct.
Sounds extremely unfair. And isn't there a lot of brain science now showing teenagers' brains aren't fully developed until around 25 years anyway? Does any of that matter when saying he had to have learned this as a teenager?
That is a good point and a whole other story. But yes, there is a lot of scientific evidence demonstrating that teenagers are essentially walking around in a state of almost constant fight or flight. In a hostile environment such as a prison, it would be very difficult for a teenager to have the ability to learn, at least initially. Just think, how well do you read or retain info when you are excited or highly aroused? This is the constant state of mind scientifically of a teenager.
I would think the scary new prison environment would surely amplify this anxiety. I would think it would be nearly impossible for any adult to meet this standard within a year, yet alone a teenager. Seems like common sense to me.
Seems like it.
Yeah, and the science says this would last for him until around age 25 or 26, so almost 6 or 7 years after entering prison.
Yes, that is right.
It isn't that he would be unable to learn, it just seems highly unlikely someone in his position and age would be able to do this all within 1 year.
But the courts are using him as the excuse, saying all he had was 1 year.
Doesn't seem fair or realistic. It seems like an unnecessary burden for the courts to place on someone, especially a young kid. You would think if a situation is wrong on the surface that the courts would want to fix it.
The courts don't seem to care, as they view this inability as more important than his constitutional rights.
You know this is unbelievable. I just mean I would never believe this if I didn't know it actually happened. I just have this belief that our judicial system built on fairness and equity would see something like this and correct it. It just seems unconscionable for a sitting judge to be okay with this. It just seems out of line with the overall big picture of what is right. It feels unfair and not equitable.
Many would agree. It is horrible.
So getting back to the circumstances for a moment. So in this case, we know there was a self-defense situation. We also know that police statements where the witnesses all depict a white boy being surrounded by gangsters before acting to save his life. We also now know, according to the DA and trial judge, that he was overcharged and convicted of multiple charges that are illegal. Is there anything else in this case that isn't right?
Unfortunately, there's a lot more, as this is all just what is on the surface and was brought up recently.
So there is more? This already seems like a lot, as far as a fair trial is concerned anyway.
For starters, I mentioned earlier about witnesses who told police that white boy was surrounded by a group of Mexican gangsters. Every eyewitness stated that the white boy was trying to back away, and it was apparent that he didn't want trouble.
Sounds like a cut and dry self-defense case so far, if you ask me.
Yeah, except 10 months later, at the trial, several of the witnesses changed or altered their testimony from the police statements to allege that the white boy was now the one who started the conflict.
What? They completely switched the narrative. Why would they do that? Was there some sort of witness tampering?
It is hard to say. What we do know is that two of the witnesses who changed their story are actually related, relatives to one of the individuals who was shot. Unfortunately, when Keith was surrounded and shot, there was one stray bullet that struck an individual who claims not to have been participating in the attack. He claims to have just been watching it unfold.
That complicates matters a little. Did he attempt to stop the altercation, or was he just standing there observing? What did he actually say? He was within feet of the whole situation, right?
He just describes himself as standing next to the group of attackers, but says he was just watching.
Could Keith have possibly thought he was a part of this group?
It is very possible. The scene is described as chaotic. These were all Hispanics, with Keith being the only white male in the area. This bystander fit this profile. He was also young, Hispanic, and in baggy clothing, obviously in a highly volatile and high-stress situation in which you are being surrounded. It opens up the potential for someone standing near an attack to either be mistaken for a part of a group that is only within feet of you, especially if you consider they are all of the same ethnicity, and it could appear you were surrounding him too.
Especially if this guy wasn't attempting to calm the situation in any way. It might even appear he was encouraging it.
Yes, that is true. But as far as the two witnesses who changed their testimony, it does turn out that two of them were family members of this bystander.
So initially, they described the victim as the white boy and later reversed to say he was the perpetrator, if you will. Do people remember better or worse as time passes?
It is common sense that our memories fade or are less accurate over time. I'm not going to get into the science of this as it is common sense, but time can actually open our memories up to suggestion.
This is interesting. So what do you think happened?
Again, it is hard to say exactly. We do know that this individual filed a lawsuit and eventually won a lawsuit against the county as a result of this.
So it's possible that these family members changed their story once they consulted an attorney and realized it would benefit themselves financially to alter their narrative. So they would have been financially motivated to do so?
That is one logical conclusion.
Did this ever come out in court?
The lawsuit was mentioned but not allowed to be discussed as the filing was made only days after the trial.
Interesting. What else happened with these witnesses? You mentioned others changing their story as well?
The other two who changed from their original statements both worked for law enforcement in some capacity.
You mean one was a cop?
Yes, so once the prosecutor took a stance on who was culpable and that Keith was the criminal and not the victim, the county employees just got in line with this story.
They didn't want to go against the district attorney, the typical us versus them mentality that is so prevalent with law enforcement.
You could say that.
Wait, so one of the actual eyewitnesses was an actual cop?
Yeah, one was an actual off-duty cop.
Off-duty? Don't they have a sworn duty to society? One that makes them never really off-duty.
Technically, yes, they always have a duty to protect society.
Well, if this guy was a cop, what did he do? I mean, if he was standing there, did he just watch also? This is news to me. He couldn't have intervened and stopped this whole situation before it happened?
I don't know. He said the situation appeared very dangerous. He said he saw a white kid being surrounded. He said he left to go get some help from other officers as he didn't have a weapon on him. Actually, he says he turned to get some help and that's when he heard gunshots.
Wait, he saw a situation that was so dangerous that he was scared? If he is a cop and he is scared, Keith must have felt terrified. This trained law officer said this?
Sure did.
So instead of stepping in, he left Keith to fend for himself and went to go get help.
That is what he said.
I hate to bring this up, but why isn't he liable? I mean, he has a sworn duty to protect. He could have stepped in to protect Keith and we never would have this situation, but he said he didn't because he felt the situation was dangerous and he didn't have a weapon. I don't mean to sound judgmental, but it sounds like cowardice to me.
Definitely one way to look at it.
I mean, the way I see it is this guy a trained law officer, trained for these situations, yet he leaves this teenage kid to face this dangerous situation himself. And then here we are, charging the kid when we think he should have handled it differently.
Good point. It does seem a little hypocritical and unfair.
And not only that, but this was multiple people, described as Mexican gang members surrounding this little bitty white kid.
Well, records did show that he was only 130 pounds and a teenager.
What was he supposed to do? Get killed? Wow, this is absolutely hypocritical. Keith did what the officer should have done. He stood up to this gang. This officer should be charged for this, not Keith. This cop's cowardice directly led to this. His duty was to intervene. Instead, he turned away. Didn't they just charge some cops in Texas for not intervening in a school shooting? I think this wannabe cop needs to be charged also. Who is he?
Well, his name is in the show notes and witness statements, but we'll leave it at that.
Sorry, I just think it is outrageous that this could have been avoided. What is it with these cops in Texas? No wonder this guy tried to switch it and make Keith into the bad guy, or his cowardice would have been on full display.
That is definitely what some people are saying. That and that he rolled with what the prosecutor wanted him to say.
I don't mean to go off on that topic, but if all of these witnesses originally said these gangsters were attacking the white boy, was there anyone who didn't change their testimony who corroborated this? I mean, who didn't work for the state or who wasn't financially motivated?
Funny you ask that, as there was one independent eyewitness who was only a few feet away from Keith when the entire attack began. She told police investigators that she saw the whole thing.
She must have some key information.
Yes, she provided some key information that supported a narrative of a group of Mexicans who were surrounding a white boy. What made her statement so unique and important is that she said it seemed like the Mexicans, her language, were trying to almost force one of the other friends in the group to go and fight the white boy, even to the point of pushing their friend in the direction of the white boy to encourage a fight of some kind.
Very insightful. Did she say how Keith was responding to this?
This was also unique in that no other witness could confirm what or if Keith said anything to this group. This was a key issue in which the prosecutor claimed the evidence showed Keith saying something to provoke this gang. Yet here is this eyewitness who can positively refute this and says not only was Keith backing away to avoid a confrontation, but she could specifically hear Keith telling him he did not want any trouble with them.
That sounds very crucial, as here is the prosecutor saying Keith started a confrontation and even provoked a group of gang members, which doesn't make any sense to me anyway. But you have a key eyewitness saying Keith could not have provoked it because she actually heard him telling the group he did not want trouble and was physically backing away from them to avoid it all. So the prosecutor's argument didn't actually mesh with the known evidence then.
Well, except that this witness never made it to court or the trial.
What do you mean? That is a key witness.
No one knows for sure. Keith never learned of this witness until after his trial when he was reviewing the records from his attorney years later that were sent to him.
Was it withheld, like a Brady violation?
Good question. We don't know if it was hidden or if Keith's trial attorney was so bad that he never investigated nor called this eyewitness to testify.
That is wild to think about.
Yes, we aren't sure because we do know that Keith's attorney spent less than 1 hour meeting and speaking and preparing with Keith prior to this case going to trial over 10 months.
Less than 1 hour total? How is that possible? This is a complicated case. Isn't the attorney required to speak to his client?
You would think so, but his attorney, despite being highly rated attorney, spoke to Keith, his client, on around 4 separate occasions with no session lasting longer than 15 minutes. We know this as it is verifiable by the county jail attorney visit log records that we were able to obtain and look at.
So if this attorney didn't even speak to his client, he may not have spoke to this witness either?
Exactly, but as of right now, we aren't sure if it is a Brady violation or simply negligence and incompetence by the trial attorney. Definitely ineffectiveness. It could be attorney incompetence, as we already know, now that the attorney never objected to the extra charges that we already spoke about that are illegal. Obviously, he did not do his job.
That is a good point. But prosecutors also have a duty to fairness.
I agree with that statement also.
So this witness was a huge deal? I mean, her statements contradicted the entire prosecutor's theory of the way this conflict occurred.
Well, the prosecutor knew there were witnesses saying Keith was trying to avoid this conflict, but the prosecution decided they were going to get a conviction and had a story of their own that Keith was a pistol-packing thug who started a problem so that he could finish it. They even pushed forward a law that really should only be used in the rarest of circumstances that essentially said, if Keith started a conflict in any way, then he could not claim self-defense.
Rare circumstances? What do you mean by that?
Well, it is just a law that prevents someone who already has a problem with someone from being able to initiate a conflict and then justify the return aggression by the individual that he provoked and then claiming self-defense when the individual then defends himself. Basically, it prevents initiating a shootout with your enemy and then claiming self-defense.
So it needs a sort of pre-existing intent and plan ahead of time. Sounds more like a premeditated conflict.
Yes, exactly.
But that didn't really fit with the evidence in this situation, did it?
That is the whole thing in this situation. If you hide a witness and then alter a little of the testimony, which we saw with the changing of the testimony, from being straightforward self-defense into a more ambiguous and less clear situation, then a knowing prosecutor can then use the law that is rare and apply it against someone in a way that is not fair.
So the laws apply to certain factual circumstances. But if you change the way the circumstances appear, then you can argue that laws that don't really apply to the case actually do apply.
Yes.
And then the jurors wouldn't know this occurred. Would this fall under jury instruction errors? How would this affect the trial?
Yes, it falls under jury instruction errors. It opens the door for different burdens of what needs to be proven in court.
So, what you are saying is that instead of considering whether Keith was in fear of his life, and this is the burden of proof, the prosecutors could or did use this law that is more of a provocation law to make the burden about whether or not Keith said anything to this group that was offensive or not. And then when you compound this with hiding the witness who heard Keith say he didn't want trouble, the prosecutor was able to argue that Keith not only was not in fear, but provoked the entire situation, knowing it was not really true.
Exactly.
Wow, that is a lot of things going on that made this a complicated trial. And this is what they wanted Keith to be able to explain by himself on an appeal as a teenager? I barely get it now. But really, I still can't believe the attorney would only speak to him for about 45 minutes or so over a 10-month period of time. Personally, I think that should require a new trial in itself. It just shows why he was unprepared, and it explains why they charged Keith illegally and no one said anything at the time. Couldn't Keith just get on the stand and explain what happened himself? That would straighten out a lot of things for the jury.
Yes, it is very logical for a jury to wish to hear a defendant testify, especially in a self-defense claim, that the victim would wish to explain his perspective on things.
Did he?
Well, he says he tried to and wanted to, but at the trial, his attorney told him he wasn't allowing him to do so.
You mean advised him? I thought, and I'm pretty sure the client makes that decision.
That's the thing. Keith was only a kid, a teenager at that time. He did not know anything about the law. This was the 1990s, and sometimes the judges didn't always make sure to explain this properly to a defendant. This right is always acknowledged in open court nowadays. This is a fundamental right, but at this time, judges didn't always verify this, which opens up a situation like this, where a teenager is misinformed.
Keith was never told this in open court or verified he knew this?
On the contrary, Keith says he even argued with his attorney about wanting to testify, but that the attorney flat out refused to allow him to testify.
That is a big claim, but doesn't it really just boil down to Keith's word against the attorney?
Actually, in this case, there is a record of Keith's attorney acknowledging his role in deciding this for Keith and gave the specific reason that he refused Keith his right.
What did he say?
The trial attorney and co-counsel both said they decided not to let Keith testify because Keith was not remorseful for the situation.
What? I don't get it. First, I thought it was the defendant's right. But secondly, that sounds off, as how is remorse part of self-defense? You don't have to feel remorse to feel you acted in self-defense, do you? I mean, I would think that someone who was forced to act in self-defense would feel glad that he acted to defend his life, not remorseful. Sounds more like the attorney rationalizing.
Good points. This is all actually in a record. Keith states that his attorney refused to let him testify against his will to testify. He says no one ever told him or explained that it is his right, regardless of what the attorney wants. When the attorney told him he was not allowing it, Keith was under the impression that his attorney gets to decide that. Remember, he was just 19 and scared, and listened to the attorney and believed he was telling him the truth.
Scary to think about this happening in America. His testimony could have changed things.
Yeah, it is very big, especially when self-defense comes down to your own perception of events.
So if a jury never got to hear what Keith was feeling, was he afraid, etc., how would they possibly know?
Exactly. Which leads us to something more sinister that occurred. Well, worse, or convenient, and wouldn't even be permitted in a courtroom in Texas today, as it was outlawed in 2009 as a questionable and unreliable practice.
Well, this was the 1990s. What happened that was so sinister and illegal under today's ethics?
The prosecution used an uncorroborated jailhouse snitch to allege Keith confessed to him his true feelings of what happened.
What? A confession of self-defense? Sounds suspect.
Yeah, since without Keith to testify, the prosecutor decided to use their new star witness who came forward the day of the start of the trial to say Keith told him what Keith was really feeling that night.
Let me guess. It wasn't self-defense?
Pretty convenient, right? And who would even say that?
Did this guy receive a deal to say this?
The prosecution said they weren't giving him any deal. However, it is discovered that this informant wrote a note to the prosecutor's office that he was seeking help and was ironically released from jail shortly after his testimony in this case.
Must have just been a coincidence. So let me get this straight. Keith was not allowed to testify to his perception of events. Then, the day of trial, a jailhouse informant comes out of nowhere and is allowed to testify and tells the jury that Keith told him he was not in fear for his life and did not act in self-defense. And how long was he around Keith prior to Keith confiding in him? I mean, they must have been close.
Records show that he was only around Keith for a few days. Being that he came forward the day of the trial, there was no real way to investigate any of this.
Unbelievable.
And he even said that Keith's real motive was an adrenaline rush.
Wow, how convenient. So Keith is a daycare worker and college student by day and an adrenaline junkie who shoots people by night.
Sounds outrageous, doesn't it?
So what about sentencing? How did the sentencing part of the trial go? I mean, sentencing is the part of the trial when a jury gets to hear the character of the defendant and to weigh it along with variables such as age and prior background to see how it fits with the crime and to then come up with an appropriate sentence, right?
Yes, these things are supposed to be considered. But in this case, they were not.
What do you mean?
Well, no one was called to testify.
You mean Keith did not have anyone to say anything good?
No, on the contrary, there were nearly 20 people who actually attended the trial on Keith's behalf, wanting to testify, and went to the trial thinking they would have the opportunity to do so at some point.
Well, why didn't they?
When it came time to present a defense, Keith's attorney just said he had no witnesses.
What? That isn't even accurate.
Yeah, I know.
Well, what were some of the things these witnesses were or could have said? Do we know?
Yes, we actually do, because many of them were very upset at not being able to speak up for Keith. Many have since made sworn affidavits summarizing what they would have said on Keith's behalf. There were different witnesses. For instance, one who wanted to share how Keith worked as a teacher's aide at a Catholic school and was looked up to by the kids he mentored there. She wanted to explain how she had known Keith for a long time and how young he is, and still was always a good role model with a positive and helpful attitude when he was around.
Wow, so he wasn't some thug after all?
No, not even close. At least not according to the witnesses. Honestly, Keith was only one semester removed from graduating high school and was enrolling in college. He had went to college straight out of high school and had returned to town in order to work at the youth school and to attend classes simultaneously. There were all sort of witnesses willing to testify for Keith. Some relatives, some neighbors, and others were friends. Most everyone said Keith was just a young kid with a lot of potential who was genuinely a good kid that excelled in sports and was generally a positive influence in the community.
So not the type of kid to go looking for trouble?
No, his younger brother even spoke about Keith being an instrumental part of his decision to attend college and pointed out how Keith had mentored him in school and in sports.
That is a lot of positive, especially in someone as young as he was at the time.
Yeah, and most even gave the opinion that, from what they know of Keith, he would never shoot anyone unless he was truly frightened for his life.
That is big and would have been helpful for the jury to hear, especially to give a fair sentence.
Yes, it is.
Was there anyone who knew Keith who said anything negative about him?
It depends on how you define knew him. I would say the only people who testified against him were jailers in the jail Keith was being held at. They tried to frame Keith as bad and seemed to base it on the fact at one point Keith was depressed and suicidal. I mean, this was the 1990s when mental health was stigmatized and received less sympathy.
They used this against him? It sounds normal for someone who is locked up to be depressed. I mean, this was a teenager trying to cope with being locked up after having to defend himself from being attacked by a gang. It would be difficult to deal with feeling being attacked twice. I mean, my son can't even deal with me telling him to clean his room, yet alone something like this.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, a few of the jailers stated Keith was not good without any specifics as to why they said it.
I didn't know that was allowed. Wouldn't a jailer just say anyone in jail is bad and had or has a bad reputation? It is a jailer. What else would they say?
It does seem improper, but the judge allowed it.
Anyone who actually knew Keith in real life?
Only one person. A baseball coach that coached Keith for a few months stated that at some point he heard someone say Keith had done some bad things before.
Like what?
He didn't say. He gave no specifics.
So like hearsay? Except without specifics? He could have at least said he missed a ground ball or something. I mean, seriously, I thought hearsay wasn't allowed.
It happened. Definitely felt like the DA was fishing. Alluding to a lot, but not coming up with anything. Basically no specifics. Just a bunch of jailers without specifics and a coach without specifics.
Wow. How does a jury calculate that?
Usually a defense attorney would bring in witnesses to show Keith was a kid going to college. Pretty basic stuff. Just show Keith's character and situation of being a productive member of society compared to the criminals who attacked him. The evidence was all favorable and showed Keith was a good kid.
But that didn't happen?
No, the attorney just did not call anyone to say anything.
Does that happen very often?
Maybe if there is something to hide, like a criminal record or something.
But in this situation, the information was mostly good.
Yes, Keith was a teacher's aide. They even spoke about how Keith was doing laundry with his girlfriend just before this all occurred.
Doesn't sound like the premeditated killer the prosecutor described.
Not at all. And what is worse is that the prosecutor used this against Keith by arguing to the jury that the real reason no one came to speak up for Keith was because no one existed because Keith was not a good person at all.
And that was not even close to being true. That must have been painful for Keith and all those people who were there but couldn't testify because Keith's attorney did not let them either. No wonder they were mad and made affidavits.
It would have been hard for me to hear that also, knowing it wasn't true.
Do you think this is why Keith got so much time?
I'm sure not hearing from any witness played into it. Here Keith is saying he is a good kid who was attacked by gangsters, but no one is verifying this. The prosecutor is saying Keith is a thug, and it doesn't matter if there are 100 witnesses to contradict this, if his attorney never puts them on the stand to talk. His attorney was horrible and incompetent. He didn't even point out to the jury that teenagers are actually the most prone to changing and not ever getting in trouble again, to counter the prosecution, saying how this was a lost cause kid.
And that's not taking into account all the questionable tactics and all the overcharging that was used also.
Right.
Back to the witnesses for a moment. Did the attorney ever speak to any of them? Or did he just not call them without really having an idea of what they would say?
Usually an attorney has an obligation to speak to witnesses and see, or at least get an idea of what they might say before deciding to call them or not. But he did not do that in this case either.
So he was negligent?
Definitely incompetent and ineffective.
So really, from the multiple convictions that the courts now agree are illegal, to the tampering with witnesses, to lying and incentivized snitch testimony, and errors with the jury instructions to the lawyer preventing Keith from testifying and not calling any witnesses, this case doesn't seem to fit the definition of a fair trial and accurately depict how our justice system should obtain convictions.
Not at all, and don't forget the lawyer only speaking to the client for less than 1 hour in total, from the day he was hired and assigned the case over a 10-month period of time.
Yeah, that is super crazy to me. That is also why this attorney did not call any witnesses. He did not do anything. This case needs a new look and trial, a fair trial.
Definitely not the trial I would want for myself or for anyone I care about.
It just doesn't seem right or fair. Can you imagine going to a party and then being attacked and having to defend yourself? Keith didn't ask for that to occur, then trusting in the system but ending up with 5 life sentences as a teenager? It touches me at my soul.
Especially when you consider a lot of this could have been avoided. I mean, you had a cop right there who ran away.
And don't forget, the gangsters weren't even legally allowed to be at the Mardi Gras. Remember, one was on probation and wasn't allowed in the county, and one was not even supposed to be in the country.
It is heartbreaking, especially when you consider that Keith is still fighting this today and is still in prison after 27 years.
Wow, has he been okay in there?
Surprisingly, or maybe not, as Keith has always stood his ground and stood for what is right, but he went in and finished school.
You mean college?
Yeah, he enrolled when he got in to not let time get away. He said that he got a trade degree and then an associate degree and also a bachelor's degree. He does a lot of mentoring, was an inmate peer educator, helping others learn about basic health and disease. We spoke to him recently where he is a college tutor, helping other inmates complete their college degrees also. He has become quite the fitness advocate and passes his belief that physical betterment as well as spiritual and mental betterment all go hand in hand.
Sounds like he is the same person he was in the world before he was attacked that day.
He has grown up a lot as he was a teenager back then, but he tries to use his experiences to help others where he is at, while keeping his faith that his circumstances will turn out okay one day.
Is he going to ever get a new trial?
Well, that is the big question and reason for this podcast. Keith and his supporters need your help. They are asking you to spread the word and to stand up with Keith against this injustice and to make your voice heard as well for systemic reform to the criminal justice system. Keith and his supporters feel that any time the courts look at a case and agree that it is unjust but don't correct it, then something is not right and we need change. To acknowledge something is not right but not correct, it is not justice. It is injustice.
So we can spread the word? Can we donate to help with an attorney?
Join the fight for justice. Support Keith St.Aubin. To become one of Keith's supporters, visit our official website, kmsinjusticeinamere.wixsite.com/mysite. There you can read Keith's full story and access firsthand witness statements that support his claim of self-defense. Stay connected. Facebook, Injustice in America, the Keith St.Aubin story. Shop for a cause, www.sinnersaintshop.com. 100% of proceeds go directly to Keith's legal fund. Secondhand with Purpose, www.secondchancethriftinc.com. GoFundMe, help raise the legal funds to get Keith back into court. And as always, your prayers and support mean everything. His fight is our fight. Self-defense is not murder.